Good afternoon and welcome to our first session of the Oxford Political Thought Seminar with myself, Usaama al-Azami, and Faisal Devji, who are the co-conveners of a series of seminars that discuss political thought in an Islamic register. We cover everything from pre-modern to modern Islam, and we are delighted to invite some of the world's leading authorities on Islamic thought. And they usually join us in pairs discussing contemporary Islamic and medieval Islamic political thought, followed by a discussion. And this week, I'm really absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Valerie Hoffman, from Emeritus Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she is a specialist on a range of areas and has covered a very broad array of eras, and also engaged in considerable amount of ethnographic work, particularly in Egypt, but also in sort of on the coast of Africa, Zanzibar, and is today here to speak about Ibadism. So this week's seminar is on the theme of dissent. And Valerie is speaking on charges of radicalism, Ibāḍī, Wahhābī polemics, and the articulation of identity. She is, of course, one of the world's leading authorities on Ibadi Islam, a branch of Islam which is very often understudied and undertaught as well. And I'm sure your students will not be able to complain that at the University of Illinois. But with that, we're really delighted to have you, Valerie, and we really look forward to your presentation. And then Faisal, my co-convener, and I will join you in a discussion thereafter. For any audience members, I would like to just remind you that you're more than welcome to ask questions in the chat. Those will show up for me, and I will put them to Valerie in the sort of latter half of this discussion. I would really take advantage of this because we are very fortunate just to have Valerie this week, so there's plenty of time for discussion. And we look forward to seeing you every 2 weeks during term time. But I would like to first thank again Valerie for making the time, and you can take it from here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be speaking with you. So I'm going to begin by recalling some violent incidents that occurred in the Mazab Valley, Algeria, which is one of the North African enclaves of where Ibadi communities remain, from November 2013 to April 2014, and then again in March 2015. Multiple violent incidents that resulted in more than 20 deaths, scores of people wounded, the desecration of Ibadi tombs, and the burning of many shops and homes, and forcing hundreds of families to flee. And of course, damaging the livelihood of many people, particularly Ibadi merchants. So these incidents, which are known as Ahdath Ghardeya being both the name of the province where it occurs, as well as the capital city of that province, were described by the media as ethno-sectarian violence between Ibadi Amazigh and Maliki Arabs. Now, many writers disputed the idea that it really was ethno-sectarian violence, because Ibadis and Malikis had enjoyed peaceful coexistence for centuries. And so there were other explanations offered, economic and political changes that caused various problems. Some blamed criminal elements from a part of the town of Ghardeya, which is popularly called Mexico because of the power of local drug cartels. But all of that raises the question of why would violence occur at this particular point in time in particular. And so many writers, thought that foreign hands were involved in trying to to damage Algerian national unity at a time when there was a lot of sectarian violence in some other countries of the Muslim world. While others said this is typical deflection of blame from a problem that is really homegrown. So another explanation was that the incidents were actually engineered by the government in preparation for the presidential election in April 2014, in which Abdulaziz Bouteflika was running for a fourth term as president, even though he had had a stroke in 2013. And the violence was meant to strike fear in the local population and convince them that they can only be safe if the current regime is reelected. So eyewitnesses spoke of the complicity of police and security forces who encouraged criminal elements to attack Ibadi homes and businesses and helped them by tossing tear gas canisters into houses, standing by idly while Malikis entered an Ibadi mosque and announced over loudspeakers from the mosque a jihad against the Ibadis. So suspicions of the government's culpability seem to be confirmed by the fact that the violence ended abruptly on April 17th, 2014, the day of the presidential election. So, as we know, sectarian violence can never be reduced to a single cause. So more than one of these explanations is plausible. But for purposes of this talk, because I'm talking about Ibadi Wahhabi polemics, I'm going to focus on one explanation in particular, and that was that some people said Salafi sheikhs stirred up hatred for Ibadis. Now, I should just pause and say that in this talk, I'm I'm using Wahhabi when I'm specifically referring to Saudis. I realize that Wahhabis don't like to be called Wahhabis. They call themselves Salafis, but the word Salafi has many different meanings, right? And so, but when we have sheikhs in Algeria who identify with the ideology of Saudi Arabia, they are typically called Salafi, right, rather than Wahhabi. So I just recognize that the appellations can be complicated. But in any case, the Saudi-owned channel Iqra was blamed for disseminating hatred in Algeria. At the end of October 2013, a conference was held in Amman, Jordan, on the topic, the Khawarij and their persistence until the time of the Antichrist, a Dajjal. And of course, this language is drawn from Hadith, right? So it was all, it was about what does it all mean? And this program, which was broadcast on Iqra, in this program, an Algerian sheikh identified the Ibadis as the Khawarij of our time, describing them as unbelievers beyond the pale of the Ummah and the Millah. I mean, they're just not beyond the pale of proper Islamic belief, but they're not even in the Ummah of Islam. And citing proof texts from Hadith that allow the shedding of their blood, the violation of their women, and the plunder of their property. So one Algerian reporter wrote, from the first time this was broadcast a month ago, the flames of fitna, of discord in Ghardeya have increased. It is not a coincidence that its rebroadcast 3 days ago coincided with the first violent incident after fanning the flames of fitna. Demonstrations began right after the broadcast. After 6 citizens were killed, more than 60 wounded, stores burned, property looted, families forced out of their homes. The demonstrations were by followers of Iqra, who repeated the slogan, La ilaha illallah al-Ibadi aduwallah, meaning there is no God but Allah, and Ibadis are the enemies of Allah. Now, there are hadiths, of course, in which the Prophet Muhammad predicted the emergence of a group labeled al-Mariqa. And Mariqa means to fly, shoot, or penetrate. It's linked to an expression, Mariqa sahm, the arrow has passed through, meaning the matter is finished. And so in a hadith, the Prophet said that people from my ummah will leave the religion as fast as an arrow leaves the bow when it's shot. You will look at the place where it lands, you'll see nothing. Now, most authors interpret this as a reference to the radical Khawarij, the Kharijites of early Islam. And some versions encourage the Muslims to kill al-Mariqa wherever they find them. Now, as this audience probably knows, the Khawarij or Kharijites originally were those who abandoned Ali at the Battle of Siffin in the year 657 of the Common Era, when he agreed with his nemesis Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, agreed to the proposal to submit their disagreement to human arbitration. Those who rejected the arbitration were called al-Muhakkima, because of their slogan, La hukm illa lillah, there is no judgment but God's. The meaning of the term Khariji or Khawarij in the plural has been debated. Could mean leaving Ali's army. Some say that it means they left the Ummah altogether. Some say it means it refers to their readiness to go out to wage jihad in the path of God. The Khawarij split into various sects, and the one that is most commonly thought of when people think of the Kharijite label is the Azraqa, the Azraqis or Azariqa, the group that was led by Nafi ibn Azraq. They, of course, are the most radical. They're the ones who believe that the commission of grave sin or persistence in minor sin without repentance makes one an unbeliever who has committed apostasy and should be killed. And they said all true believers should migrate away from the society of unbelievers to their camp to do a new hijrah, like the migration of the Muslims from Mecca to Medina in 622, and that they should wage war against the group's opponents. Those who do not join them should be killed, their property seized, their women and children enslaved. The Azraqis terrorized parts of what are today Iran and Iraq, but the movement was defeated and largely eliminated by the Umayyads near the close of the 7th century. So they haven't existed for a very long time. Now, other Kharijite groups rejected the necessity of a hijrah, and although they also felt that the labels Muslim and believer should be reserved for observant members of their own group, and they felt, yes, it's a good thing to overthrow tyrants if possible, they also believed it is permissible to live peaceably together alongside other Muslims and to hide one's true beliefs in a hostile environment. And so that orientation includes the group that came to be called Ibadis. And today, Ibadis are the only remaining group that adheres to the position of the original Muhakkima, those who rejected the arbitration. Ibadis reject the label Khariji because people associate Kharijism with violence against other Muslims, and that's never been an Ibadi practice. Ibadis, of course, are a distinct branch of Islam. They're not Sunni or Shiite, and they're a very tiny minority in the Muslim world, less than 1% of the world's Muslims. And although Ibadism emerged in Basra back in the 8th century, they were forced out of that region of southern Iraq through persecution. Most of them, since they were descended from tribes that had come from Arabia, went back to Arabia. But they also sent out missionaries, though, to North Africa, where Ibadism became a vehicle for indigenous people's rejection of the Arab conquests. And so Ibadi imamates states that were founded on the basis of Ibadism were established in Oman, the Hadramaut, Yemen, and North Africa. But conquests by non-Ibadi groups and conversions out of Ibadism to Sunni Islam led to a loss of Ibadism's hold on most of North Africa and all of Yemen. So the only state today that claims that the majority of its Muslims are Ibadi is the Sultanate of Oman. Although there are disagreements about statistics, but that's what they claim in any case. In North Africa, Ibadi communities may be found today in remote areas, the Mazab Valley in Algeria, the Nafusa Mountains of northwest Libya, and the island of Djerba in Tunisia, as well, of course, as migrants to the capital cities of those countries. In addition, Omani rule in East Africa, which began as early as the 17th century, and economic problems in Oman in the 19th century led to the migration of many Ibadis from the Omani interior to the Swahili coast. And there are some Ibadis that remain there today. Now, as you may know, Khariji has been used as a pejorative label for all radical Muslim groups in the world today, those that engage in terrorism in violence against Muslim targets. So to call the Ibadis Khawarij is to imply that they are radical extremists that pose a danger to the Ummah. On the other hand, there have not been any Ibadi terrorist groups. On the contrary, most Muslim terrorists, as we know, have been inspired by Wahhabi, Salafi attitudes and teachings. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi movement in the 18th century, as probably many of you know, drew on a Hanbali tradition that deemed practice essential to faith, which is a point on which Ibadis actually agree. Whereas most Sunni Muslims would say that a Muslim who doesn't pray, but who acknowledges the obligation of prayer is a negligent Muslim, Wahhabis would say, not just Wahhabis, but even many of the Hanbalis would say, no, anyone who abandons prayer is a kafir, is an unbeliever. The 12th century Ibn al-Jawzi said such a person should be killed. And of course, as we know, Ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century considered popular veneration of holy places to be un-Islamic and to be tantamount to shirk, to polytheism. And he called on his supporters to fight against the polytheists until they adhered to monotheism, meaning the Wahhabi creed and way of life. He also didn't hesitate, not in his theoretical writings, but in his sort of more informal, like his letters, to denounce even Hanbali scholars who didn't accept Wahhabi teachings, to denounce them as kuffar, as not just kuffar, but guilty of shirk, I mean, kuffar, I'll talk about the meaning of that word a little bit later. Kuffar is usually translated as unbelievers. In the case of Ibadism, I prefer to use a different translation because kuffar can mean more than one thing in Ibadi thought. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's son Abdullah denied that Wahhabis considered all other Muslims kuffar, but Abdullah's son Suleiman said that not only the Shia, but non-Wahhabi Sunnis are kuffar. And when the Wahhabis captured Mecca in 1803, Suleiman compelled the ulama and qadis to give an oath of allegiance to the Wahhabi creed. And when they protested that they were being treated like kuffar, Suleiman said, well, we disavow all the people of our time except those who belong to our group. So the Egyptian Ottoman invasion of Wahhabi territory in the early 19th century led to the rise of a discourse of separation that had long-lasting impact. I mean, right to this day, because Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who invaded Arabia on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, was successful. Many Saudi vassals sort of defected from the Wahhabi camp. And Suleiman saw this as a betrayal not only of Wahhabism, but of Islam itself. He said that such people have gone over to the enemy, to the land of idolatry, and he made it a requirement for all true Muslims to migrate to Wahhabi-controlled territory. So, this has had a long impact even into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, another Wahhabi sheikh expressed horror when he heard that some of the brethren who lived in Oman had made friends with Ibadis. And he wrote that it's contrary to faith to be kind to Jahmis, Ibadis, and tomb worshippers, because they are kuffar. And he cited hadiths that encouraged true Muslims to kill such people, assuring them that they would be rewarded on the day of judgment. So Salafis have often regarded other groups, including the Ibadis, as part of an insidious conspiracy to destroy Islam from within. And of course, they see themselves as the only ones who can save it. Now, the Saudi kingdom, of course, has moderated its practice. And right with the beginning with the founder of the third Saudi state, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And but Wahhabism, of course, in its doctrine, remains hostile to many deep-rooted Islamic tendencies, including Sufism, Shi'ism, theology, etc. And really the hard-won ethos of coexistence and tolerance of a diversity of perspectives that really has characterized much of the history of Sunni Islam. Now, from the outset, Wahhabism's critics compared Wahhabis to Kharijites, by which they meant Azraqis, right? And so the Ottomans called them a despicable Kharijite sect, referred to their Kharijite swords that wreaked havoc on Muslim countries, and Ibadis also likened the Wahhabis to the Azarqa in their practice of takfir. I think, takfir is a term so many of us use now, it probably doesn't need explanation, but it means calling other people unbelievers or polytheists. And also the demand of hijrah to their own territory was similar to the Azarqa, and their bloody wars against other Muslims. So when the Wahhabis in the late 18th and early 19th century conquered much of what today is the Sultanate of Oman and convinced many people in that area to embrace Wahhabi doctrines, the leading Ibadi scholar of Oman at the time, Abu Nabhan al-Kharusi, rejected the idea that the Wahhabis could be Hanbalis, because he said Hanbalis don't declare the people of the Qibla to be unbelievers or deem it permissible to kill them, enslave their children, and plunder their wealth. So he said, these are Azraqi practices, which means that they've taken some things from Hanbalism, some things from Azraqism, and created something new. And he called Wahhabism a terrible calamity. And he said that there is no basis in religion to label members of the Ummah as mushrikeen, polytheists. And so he said the Wahhabis are the Mariqa of the Hadith, right? And they are the real Khawarij. And so we have, and that idea was adopted by other Ibadis as well. So we have an ironic situation in which Ibadis and Wahhabis accuse each other of being Kharijite, meaning radical, and while each group claims to be the only one that preserves the original Islam of the Salaf, okay, so the pious ancestors. Now, one thing I found interesting as I was learning about, I looked very much at the history of the 19th century in Oman. That's one area that I've really looked at a lot. British officers in the 19th centuries saw a great deal of similarity between Wahhabis and Ibadis, including a tendency toward Puritanism, if you like, and stern application of the law, prohibitions against smoking and against decorating mosques and tombs, a lack of veneration of saints and belief in their intercession. So some British observers even conflated the two groups, thinking, for example, that Azan ibn Qais, who was brought to power in 1868 as a result of a conservative Ibadi uprising that overthrew the ruler of Oman and put him in power as the Imam, the British resident in the Gulf at the time described him as having strong Wahhabi views and tendencies. And so, you know, this idea that they're really the same. And so both groups do believe that only those who fulfill their religious obligations should properly be called Muslims and believers. Both groups prioritize the Quranic imperative of commanding the right, forbidding the wrong. And the Ibadi conservatives who led a series of uprisings against the Sultanate of Oman in the 19th and early 20th century refer to themselves as al-Mutawi'a, those who enforce obedience, which is a clear echo of the Wahhabi use of the term. And the British political agent in Muscat, when Azan ibn Qais was in power as the Ibadi Imam, says that the Mutawa'a held the populace in Muscat in a vice of fear, issuing strict regulations about dress and public behavior, prohibiting the use of tobacco and prohibiting music in public. They zealously strode the streets, cane in hand, vigilantly looking for backsliders. This description is quite resonant, isn't it, of Saudi Arabia's religious police? So you can understand perhaps some of this. Another thing that Ibadis and Wahhabis share is a strong emphasis on the doctrine of walaya, which mean, or wala, as the Wahhabis say, which means loyalty or affiliation or association on the one hand, wala or walaya with Muslims, and bara or bara'a, meaning dissociation or disavowal of those who are considered the enemies of God. In order to maintain the purity of their communities, both of them have really emphasized this doctrine and have a strong preoccupation with this distinction between those who are in and those who are out of the group. And so, of course, there is a Quranic basis for these concepts. I'll just read a little description written by a 10th century Ibadi scholar describing the behavior appropriate to dissociation. He says, the enmity of the Muslims for infidels, if they do the deeds of infidelity, is demonstrated by speaking harshly to them, hating them, separating from them, avoiding sitting with them, fighting them until they return to what God has commanded. Now, if out of fear, the Muslims must practice dissimulation, hiding their views, then they'll just separate from them in their hearts and hate them, deem them as miscreants, but not fight them, right? Because you have to have a certain strength to be able to fight them. And he says, whoever doesn't dissociate from infidels is not a Muslim in God's eyes. One must separate and dissociate from anyone who commits a grave sin or persists in any act of disobedience to God, no matter who he is, living or dead, father or son, distant or near. So, and this is somewhat similar to what Ibn Abdul Wahhab wrote. He wrote, a person's Islam is not sound, even if he is a monotheist towards God and deserts polytheism, unless he is hostile to polytheists and declares to them his hostility and hatred. So, so Wahhabis had this belief that society was composed of antithetical forces, of true Muslims on the one hand and polytheists on the other. And then those, of course, who pretended to be true Muslims, the hypocrites, right? So, okay, now Ibadis don't condone violence against anyone except oppressive rulers and their supporters. And then only if you have an adequate number of people who have pledged themselves to the cause to make it potentially successful. But their writings nonetheless reflect a similarly stark perspective of a society composed of antithetical forces of good and evil, at least the writings that I, from the pre-modern period, certainly do that. And so the walaya bara'a system strengthens the feeling of being a member of a closed and cohesive community. Those who violated community laws, especially in North African communities, would be excommunicated. And Ibadi in the Mazhab told me that in former times, a person who deviated from community laws would be denounced publicly in the mosque. The entire community would dissociate from him, and even his wife would not speak to him, which encouraged the miscreants' hasty public repentance and restoration to the community. So in this way, the community was sort of kept very cohesive, and the religious scholars had a great deal of authority. Now, this type of bara'a as excommunication no longer exists among Ibadis. But some of the commentators on those violent incidents in Ghardeya described Sunni resentment of the insularity of Ibadi communities in the Mazhab and the refusal of Ibadis to marry outside their own community. So I find that rather interesting. Now, despite the alleged, the similarities that are there between Ibadis and Wahhabis that the British observed, the British also commented favorably on Ibadi friendliness and tolerance. So that I'll read one quote in particular because I really like this one. The British official W.H. Ingrams, who spent a lot of time in Zanzibar as well as in the Hadramaut, said he would rather live among Ibadis than among Baptists or Methodists because, in his experience, Ibadis are the most tolerant people in the matter of religion I have known. So, and now this may strike you as odd, considering everything I just said about walaya and bara'a and the idea that only pious Ibadis could really be Muslims and believers. I will acknowledge that there is a certain disconnect between sort of the theoretical aspects of Ibadi belief in its classical versions. I think that Ibadism has changed a great deal, especially in Oman. And so disconnect between that theory and actual practice. In actual practice, you really don't see any signs of disapproval, even, let alone of disavowal of non-Ibadis. So, but there are also important differences, and one of the biggest differences is the interpretation of kufr, which is usually translated as unbelief. I prefer to translate kufr as infidelity or unfaithfulness because the Ibadis distinguish kufr shirk, which would be the unfaithfulness of unbelief. On the one hand, that would be polytheism. And they say no member of the Ummah should ever be accused of polytheism, okay? So but that's one type. But then those who are either have errors in their doctrine, they're not Ibadi, or Ibadis who commit grave sins and don't repent, are also unfaithful to God. And so that type of infidelity is called kufr nifaq, the unfaithfulness of hypocrisy, or kufr ni'mah. And here kufr means ingratitude. Just as the Quran contrasts shakirin wal kafirin, right? The grateful and the ungrateful. So in this case, the kufar ni'mah are those who are ungrateful to God for his blessings. So they also insist that all members of the Ummah should have the same legal rights, regardless of their sect or their level of piety, including the rights of intermarriage in theory, which is interesting since I just said Sunnis complain that Ibadis won't let probably their daughters marry non-Ibadis. But in theory, intermarriage, mutual inheritance, praying together, no problem, Ibadis have no problem praying behind a non-Ibadi, let it behind a non-Ibadi imam in a mosque. Prayer for their dead, burial in Muslim cemeteries, greeting with the Muslim greeting, all of these, and of course eating the meat that they sacrifice, all of these are rights for the entire Ummah. The Wahhabis, on the other hand, have, at least historically, regarded those who did not embrace their doctrines as polytheists. And the Sheikh Abdulaziz bin Baz, who was the Saudi Mufti and probably the most important, the leading Saudi scholar of the 20th century, when asked if it was permissible to pray with Ibadi, said no, it is not permissible to pray with Ibadis. Other Ibadi doctrines that distinguish them from the Wahhabis are they deny that the Prophet will intercede for grave sinners. And so anyone who's in hellfire is going to remain there. And they reject all anthropomorphic descriptions of God as being literally true. So they're similar to the Mu'tazila in interpreting them in a metaphorical fashion. They deny the possibility of seeing God in the afterlife. They also say the Quran is a created expression of God's speech. It's not identical with an eternal divine attribute of speech. And they have confidence in the efficacy of human reason to know of the existence of God and something of his nature. So, and there are minor differences in practice, which is usually what people are aware of. The Ibadis pray with their hands stand by their sides, things like this. But, and Ibadis do, even though they don't have Sufi orders and they don't make pilgrimages to tombs, nonetheless, many Ibadis have been drawn to Sufi teachings, to a sort of mystical sense, and the leading Ibadi scholars in Oman in the 19th century and early 20th century, many of them were, composed mystical poetry, wrote commentaries on Ibn al-Farid's poetry, things like this. So, and this is a strong contrast with Wahhabi rejection of mysticism in any form. And so, as I said, Ibadis are not literalists in matters of theology, and they dismiss Wahhabis and Hanbalis and anyone else who takes the anthropomorphic descriptions of God literally as hashwiya, meaning, an irrational acceptance of literal texts. And whereas Sunni Muslims idealize the generation of the Prophet and his companions and say that the great fitna, the great civil war that broke out a mere 34 years after the Prophet's death, was a legitimate disagreement in matters of ijtihad, right? That's often what is said among people who were all righteous. The Ibadis don't accept that. They believe that the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, abandoned righteousness after the first 6 years of his rule, that ultimately he deserved to be assassinated when he refused either to abdicate or to repent, and that Muawiyah and his supporters, who rejected the rightful imamate of the fourth caliph, Ali, were rebels who committed grave injustices. So there are, one thing that I do want to say is that, of course, doctrines and practices aren't static, right? They're subject to social and political influences. And, the founder of the third Saudi state rejected a lot of the precedent. He lifted travel restrictions to other countries. He sent his sons on diplomatic missions. He had Arab advisors from Ottoman lands. He had Westerners come in and advise on economic development. He abstained from treating the Shia as idolaters. But in doing this, of course, he rejected parts of the Wahhabi heritage that have been preserved by either more conservative ulama or by radical jihadi groups, as we know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS today. In East Africa, a textbook that was written by an Ibadi in 1920 said that it's okay to feel love in one's heart for a non-Ibadi if he's nice to you, that doesn't matter as long as you also in your heart have a knowledge that this is not a religious affiliate, that it doesn't affect behavior, that if the Prophet was kind to everyone, we can be too. And finally, in Oman, since Sultan Qaboos came to power in 1970, one of the big changes has been a dramatic desectarianization of Ibadism, so that no sectarian teachings are allowed in schools or mosques. And this has led to the rise of a whole generation of Omanis, 2 generations even, who don't really know what makes Ibadis different from anybody else. And so Ibadis have come to look at all of these sectarian wars as kind of ridiculous as well as horrifying. They see themselves as the moderates par excellence, tolerant of everyone, able to mediate in the sectarian disputes of the Middle East. And the one thing, though, the Mufti of Oman, who's been the same person since 1975, Sheikh Ahmed al-Khalili, says that dissociation is important from those who are unjust. And therefore, scholars who support unjust rulers, and plenty of that in the Middle East, right, should be subject to dissociation. So he denies that Ibadis dissociate from Sunnis or Shia. He supports the unification of the Ummah, but he believes that it is totally wrong to endorse the policies or support the unjust rulers. So I'm going to end at this point. There's a lot more that could be said, but we'll stop here, and I'd be very happy to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That's really a wonderful kaleidoscopic view of both the sort of early theological debates and the resonances with some of the other theological traditions from early Islam, down to the current geopolitical concerns across different sort of nations. And I'm really happy that Ahmed al-Khalili got a call out, because I'm going to probably ask a question about him soon enough. But Faisal, I wanted to invite you if you wanted to ask any questions. I naturally have a whole host of questions related to this, and I wanted to also let the participants know, the sort of people who are joining us from around the world, actually, that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll definitely come to them. If you'd actually like to, because there's a sort of a relatively familiar crowd with us this afternoon. If you'd like to ask a question in person, I can let you sort of get hold of the mic at some point, since we have a bit of time as well. But first, let me turn to you, Faisal, please.
Thanks very much, Usaama, and thanks very much, Valerie. That really was fantastic. And as you were speaking, I thought to myself, in so many ways, some of these tensions seem to be as it were, a manifestation of what Freud might have called the narcissism of minor differences. Yes. And it's precisely, as it were, the similarities that create the conflict rather than the differences, because the problem is, how do you actually signify and identify the differences in this situation, especially in contemporary times when the name Khariji or Khawarij has become almost a kind of universal term of castigation. Right. Anyone can be called it, as you so nicely pointed out. Ibadi can call a Wahhābī Khariji. So-called moderate Muslims can call militant ones Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Khariji, and they do very frequently, and the reverse. So in a way, it's almost as if the term Khariji has become a universal identifier, and that I find really fascinating. Because it's A, such an ancient term, and B, belongs, as you nicely point out, to such a small, less than 1% of the current population of Muslims in the world. So there's something bizarrely, if you will, apart from the theological and the political issues involved. There's something of a psychic or psychological nature here, or ideology that allows for this kind of thing to happen. And I just want to add one more thing and then ask you to comment, which is that, when you were describing the British officials who were well disposed towards the Ibadis, of course, many of the same ones are also well disposed to the Wahhabis, often similar reasons, because they see them as harking back to their own Protestant and Puritan past. And as a result, perhaps you see modernist Muslims falling into the same kind of logic, where Wahhabism gets to be seen. The philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, writes in colonial India as the first throb of modernity in Islam. And it's interesting because your story could give us an alternative genealogy of such modernity, if we want to go down that road at all, through dissent and through what scholars have indeed done through the idea of the republic or republicanism. And so I found it really fascinating, just as the Mu'tazila have always been or regularly been seen since the 19th century in Western scholarship as being rationalists. The Ibadis or the Khawarij have often been seen as being the first republicans. And surely this tells upon, I'm sure it's entirely anachronistic to use these terms, but it tells on the modernist Muslim scholarship and perhaps on sort of more diffuse ideas among diverse Muslim populations. And so it's a bit of a shaggy dog question, but I just wanted to get in the different ways in which terms like Khawarij or indeed Wahhabi have been deployed from the 19th century until today. And then ask, how those deployments actually might affect the strange similarities that you pointed out, and the conflicts that come out of similarity rather than difference.
Well, I think you're raising Freud's phrase "narcissism of minor differences" is so perfect, because my husband is a psychoanalytic psychologist, and we have long conversations on these issues, and I don't claim to really fully understand it, but one of my goals in what I found is that there's been quite an interesting literature in the last couple of decades on trying to explain the rise of fundamentalism, not just in the Muslim world, but in the world at large from a psychoanalytic perspective. I'm interested also in trying to understand why were Ibadis able to give up this idea of purity as the main goal? Purification, of course, never ends, right? No one is ever going to get to the purification of the entire world. And globalization, where you are constantly encountering other points of view, despite the closed worlds we create on social media, we still encounter others and are therefore challenged with regard to our own ideas of uniquely holding on to the truth. And that dynamic can lead either to more openness or to more closedness, really, depending on the extent to which you identify this as a threat to who you are. So I am interested in, one thing I haven't talked about, and it's not really a matter of reinterpreting Ibadism, but what I find very interesting is that the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Oman has, it had a traveling exhibit, I don't know if you saw it in England, on religious tolerance in Oman. And that the Omani version of Islam is total tolerance. And in a way, this is really true. I mean, in Oman, the Sultan has given lands to Hindus to build temples. Buddhists can practice, anyone can practice. So it goes even beyond what we would normally consider the monotheistic religions, although I should note that Jews and Christians are called mushrikun in classical Ibadi literature. So they're not just kafar, they're mushrikun. But the journal that was published and actually edited by Abdurrahman al-Salmi from the ministry was called a tafahum, mutual understanding. And that was really, actually, it was Abdurrahman al-Salmi's uncle, Abdullah al-Salmi, who wrote a book called, Religious Tolerance, A Vision for a New World, in which he said that without understanding each other's religious point of view, he said all religions aim to promote good morals and kindness, etc., love, and therefore we need to understand each other and not feel threatened by each other. He felt that the future of humanity was really premised on this. So I feel that that is very interesting. So this has been a part of Oman's self-presentation to the world. And John Wilkinson, in his book on Ibadism, it was just a minor point that he said at the end when he talked about how Ibadis present themselves as peaceful and they are moderate, they are nice people. And he said, I wonder if niceness is going to be enough to excite young people in Oman. And I thought that was an interesting question. But whatever, I think the question of not only what causes groups to radicalize, but what causes groups to embrace moderation and openness. It's partly, of course, a strategic thing, right? Ibadis are a tiny minority. And in the, in the Ibadis, until the mid-19th century, called themselves firqa min al-Khawarij. They were a Kharijite sect, according to their own literature, for the most part. Sometimes, however, they also used al-Khawarij as a code term for the Azarqa. But in the late 19th century, with the growth of pan-Islamic sentiment, we start having the issuance of Ibadi works talking about the difference between the Ibadis and the Khawarij, and that Ibadis are not Khawarij. And that is, like a gut reaction now. Ibadis are going to say, we are not Khawarij. And even Abdurrahman al-Salmi objected to my even, in an article that I wrote, to my even saying that they were, he said, don't use the word Khawarij, use the word Muhakkama. And I said, but no one's going to know what that means. At least they know what Khawarij means. So, but in any case, I think that, yes, as one psychoanalyst who deals with international diplomacy, actually, Vamik Volkan, an emeritus professor at University of Virginia, he said that he uses the image of a tent, that, we all have these different identities, right? And so there is the big tent and then there's the smaller tent. And at each level, you have to have symbols to show what group this is. And that, so that when there are, as he said, similar to what Freud was saying, when there are minor differences or seemingly minor differences, it becomes even all the more important to symbolically differentiate. Now, in this case, I think in terms of attitudes towards others, Ibadis and Wahhabis today are very, very different. So in spite of all of this theoretical similarity in the language, another Ibadi scholar in Oman with whom I was co-writing an article objected to my saying that Ibadis regard non-Ibadis as kuffar. And so I gave him a whole bunch of quotes from different Ibadi literature, past and recent, and he finally went, okay, so you know the literature, okay. So clearly, he didn't want me to spread what he knew to be true, because it does not reflect contemporary Ibadi attitudes at all. And I think it's interesting that Ibadis are very proud of Ibadism. The state of Oman promotes the publication of Ibadism as a part of Omani heritage, but there are parts of that heritage that they don't want disseminated. There's one book that was written in, I think, the 15th, 16th century that is really adamant about how horrible all non-Ibadi groups are. That book is banned in Oman. Even though at first they published it, then they went, oops, that was a mistake. Let's get rid of that one. So likewise, back in 2005, there was an announcement of a discovery of a plot to overthrow the government, which, whoa, what is that? Well, it was just a study group of intellectuals who were studying the requirements of the traditional Ibadi imamate. That is a threatening thing to do in a sultanate. Ibadism theoretically does not endorse dynastic rule at all. So, but Oman, Sultan Qaboos was a very wise ruler. He was, yes, had all power in his hands, but he also knew how to exercise it with a great deal of wisdom. So after these people were all sentenced to prison terms or whatever, he swooped in and pardoned them all and took their leaders and gave them official positions in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and thereby co-opting them. And so he was very, very, very smart. I mean, when he came to power, there was still a significant Ibadi rebellion that was being conducted mainly from Saudi Arabia. Interestingly enough, the leaders of the former Ibadi imamate who were defeated by Sultan Qaboos's father, Sa'id bin Taimur, in the late 1950s, had fled into exile in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia didn't mind agitating things, roiling the situation there in Oman. And Sultan Qaboos, however, through offering positions and offering money, was able to get some people of the Ibadi imamate supporters to come back and help build a new country. And others never came back, but he was ultimately recognized by the son of the leader of the last rebellion that established the separate imamate in Oman in 1913. His son Muhammad, who had earlier written about how imamate and sultanate are constantly at odds because they're based on such totally different ideas. But ultimately, he met with Sultan Qaboos and recited a poem, which I found written in his own hand in his library in Oman, in which he praised Qaboos for his justice. And so to praise him for his justice, that's an acknowledgement that he is a legitimate imam. So I feel like, it's very interesting, the changes that have happened. Yeah.
One brief question, if I may, Usaama. As a Zanzibari myself, I just would like to think, but I may be completely wrong, that some of these changes you describe actually may have originated in Zanzibar, because, of course, they occur there first.
Yes.
And then after the revolution in 1964, you have the migration of many Zanzibaris to Oman, where they established in the civil service. You know this story better than I do. And in Zanzibar, of course, there wasn't an absolute monarchy by the time of the revolution. It was more or less a constitutional monarchy with political parties. It was not an experiment that ended well, and the Sultan was in exile. But it just makes me wonder whether actually it's the peculiar circumstances of East Africa that became a kind of laboratory for Ibadi reform.
I agree with you. I think that we really see this in I'll just say the leader of the uprising of 1913 was Nuruddin al-Salami, right? Who is actually the great grandfather of Abdurrahman al-Salami, by the way. And so it was his grandson who became the Minister of Religious Affairs, Abdullah al-Salami. Until recently, he stepped down from that position. But but the new Minister of Religious Affairs was one of the organizers of the Religious Tolerance in Oman exhibit. So I anticipate that there will be continuity there. In any case, what I guess some Ibadis in Zanzibar had written to Nuruddin al-Salami because he was the leading scholar of that generation, you know, in the very beginning of the 20th century, and said, you know, there are Muslims here who send their children to schools that have been set up by the Christians, meaning, you know, Europeans. And by then, of course, Zanzibar was a British protectorate, but there had been missionary groups of various types that had set up schools and hospitals. And people are learning foreign languages, and people are modifying their dress to include a European-style jacket on top of their, you know, the dishdasha, the robe that they're wearing. So, and he replied, oh, and some people are even trimming their beards. Ooh. So, and Nuruddin al-Salami replied that none of this is acceptable, none of it. And you really see, you know, here he is, a blind scholar in the interior of Oman, and you are contrasting this this environment. And he, of course, was the leader of an uprising that didn't manage to conquer all of Oman, but managed to conquer the interior and establish an imamate in the interior while the sultanate remained on the coast. And so the distinction between the interior and the coast became, you know, very important. But I think, yes, in Zanzibar, Zanzibar was so incredibly cosmopolitan, really. And so I think that the amount of interaction, the friendships that were formed, really strong friendships between Ibadis and other people, other Muslim groups, including among ulama. I think that you're right. It has, you know, and sometimes I see some contradictions in the person, for example, of Abu Muslim al-Bahlani, who was a great poet, but also a judge and a religious scholar in Zanzibar. He's the one who wrote that textbook saying, you know, it's okay to have affection, just in your that kind of thing. But he was a big supporter of Nuruddin al-Salami's uprising, considered himself the poet of the revolution and all of this, the Hassan ibn Thabit of this new uprising. But he also wrote to encourage Muslims to unify, to face colonialism, and even for Egyptian Muslims and Copts to unify and to make common cause. And so, you know, these apparent contradictions are, I think, a reflection of the compartmentalization of the self that we all do, right? We all wear many hats, and sometimes we wear the professor hat, and sometimes we wear the parent hat, or the you know, the national hat, the whatever hat it is, or the religious identifier hat, whatever hat it is that you're wearing. And so he could at the same time be an ardent supporter. I mean, you should read his poetry, how he praises the martyrs of the Muhakkama who were slaughtered by Ali at Nahrawan. And he says, we are thirsting to drink from the waters of Nahrawan. He's, you know, Nahrawan, which was Ali's massacre of the early Khawarij, becomes as you know, symbolically important as Karbala for the Shia, right? And so this desire to participate in that, I mean, that is about as sectarian as you can get. But on the other hand, he also promotes pan-Islamic sentiment and even nationalist sentiment when it is, you know, when it favors, when it's a good thing to do. I didn't really answer your question, but I think it's a fascinating thing, this reflection of complicatedness. But I did want to say one thing about this Zanzibar and Oman. I happened to sit in on an audience that Sheikh Abdullah Salmi, when he was Minister of Religious Affairs, gave to a visiting professor, a Muslim professor from the US, who had a group of students with him. And the professor asked him a question about Ibadism. And he replied, it's in Arabic, but he replied, the Ibadism of Oman is unlike the Ibadism that you see elsewhere because we are people of the sea. And so this influence of maritime culture that we interact. And I felt this was incredibly interesting because he was the grandson of the man who set up the imamate in the interior of Oman in opposition to the Sultanate of the coast. And so, but he says, we are people of the sea, and therefore our Ibadism is different from that of others. I found that really fascinating. Usaama.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I mean, I've got just so many questions, but we've only got around 20 minutes or so. So I mean, I'm sure we'll be able to cover a lot of terrain, but I also don't want to sort of prevent Faisal from coming back, because I was really enjoying that discussion on both of your parts. I mean, just the last thing you mentioned about poetry and saying poetry in praise of, Nahrawan, it reminded me of Imran ibn Hittan, who is a sort of prominent Khariji from the earliest generations. I forget exactly when he died, but he has a famous kind of poem. I'll just read the first line. يا ضربة من تقي ما أراد بها إلا ليبلغ من ذي العرش رضوانا. What a wonderful strike from a man of taqwa who didn't want to do anything but give contentment to his Lord, or something like that. This was in praise of the killer of Ali, right? And Imran ibn Hittan is someone who is highly regarded as a narrator by Sunnis as well. But they will always say, the Khawarij, they can be trusted in transmitting because they think anyone who sort of like commits a major sin is outside the deen. So we can certainly trust them as transmitters of hadith. But it's just fascinating, like the diversity of sort of perspectives that you have. And I guess, I mean, like a question that I spend some time thinking about is, at what point does a position become sectarian? And that's just so contingent on so many different dimensions. One of the things that you mentioned was that, in a sense, Ibadism, by becoming moderate now, the question for the next generation is, well, why should I be Ibāḍī? Like, what's special about this? This is just like anodyne, liberalism, shall we say, right? And I mean, like, it reminded me of the closing paragraphs of Francis Fukuyama's book, saying the end of history is going to be a boring place, right?
Wow.
There's nothing will excite people. It's just going to be about calculation and sort of like profit margins and things like that. Of course, we're seeing the resurgence of European right, and we're seeing the resurgence of all sorts of problematic movements around the world. And I think, I mean, like we kind of, I guess one of the questions I had was, what does the future hold now that, Ibadis have reached the end of history, right? But besides that, I also wanted to sort of query one of the points you made earlier, saying that the abandonment of salah or prayer is what constituted kufr for the Wahhabis. And you were saying, yes, some of the Hanbalis said this in the medieval era as well. But it's actually not too dissimilar to what a lot of Sunnis say more generally. It's just, I guess the Wahhabis would, put those words in action because there's an explicit hadith from the Prophet, which the Sunnis at least would consider canonical. I'm not sure about other traditions, but I expect the Ibadis to as well, where the Prophet says, Al-ahdu bayni wa baynahum as-salah, faman tarakaha faqad kafar. The covenant that they've taken with me, meaning the believers, is prayer. Whoever leaves it is a disbeliever. And, this is the same problem that you have with various hadiths where the Prophet says such and such an act is kufr. Is that literally kufr, or is it some kind of metaphorical kufr? And some of the early jurists, including Ahmad ibn Hanbal, said this is actually kufr. In fact, most of the jurists, as far as I know, said that, someone who does this and persists is an unbeliever and should be killed. Only the Hanafis, and I'm talking Sunni jurists here, only the Hanafis say it's kufr, but they should be imprisoned and beaten until they start praying again. Right? Which so the jurists actually, this pretty standard fair opinion. I think in practice it must have been honored in the breach more than in the observance. And that's why when the Wahhabis come and start practicing this in reality, it really shocks shocks people's consciousnesses. So I just wanted maybe a reflection on that. And, if we have some more time, we can go into other things, but I think, I don't want to prevent Faisal from coming back as well. So please.
I'm not sure I have a real response. I think that you raised some interesting points. I think it's still the case that in the discussion of the meaning of Iman, Sunnis, non-Hanbali Sunnis have said Iman is, the acknowledgement of the belief, the profession of the faith is just qawl, whereas the Hanbali said it was, amal wa qawl, and so the Ibadis are similar that way. But I think you're right, of course, that to articulate it is one thing, to actually, is it actually going to be practiced is another issue. So yeah, I agree with that.
And any speculations on the future of Ibadism in the context of it just becoming not distinct in any way, in a sense?
Well, actually, I think Ibadis are very proud of their beliefs. The Mufti actually has written a lot in defense of Ibadism, but his most recent work, his magnum opus, is a multi-volume work called Burhan al-Haq, the demonstration of the truth, in which he goes, devotes an entire volume to a single aspect of doctrine. Now he's finished the theology parts. Now he's getting into the fiqh part, which is less interesting to me personally. Sorry, but I think that he has this belief that any reasonable person who really will look without fanaticism or excessive allegiance to the imams of his school will recognize the reasonableness of Ibadi doctrine. And there are many people who agree with him on this. I mean, so I think even though that doesn't in any way prevent harmonious coexistence with many other people, I think that many, the Ibadi intellectuals are still very firm about their distinctiveness. Now, this is just the intellectuals. I did, until recently, there was no way to pursue a post-bachelor degree in Islamic studies and theology in Oman. Now that has changed. They now have one at Sultan Qaboos University. So they have the College of Sharia Sciences, which used to be an independent institute, and now it's a college that's been incorporated into Sultan Qaboos University. And they have a faculty of Ibadi and non-Ibadi faculty there. So, so at that time, when there was no way of pursuing a master's or doctorate in Islamic studies without going to another country where you're inevitably going to study in a Sunni institution. Now, they didn't go to Saudi Arabia for, I think, perhaps understandable reasons. They tended to prefer the Ahl Bayt University in Jordan or the Zaytuna University in Tunis. And, but I asked the Mufti, are you at all afraid about that people will be converted to Sunni Islam and will fall away, that there will be no future for Ibadism? And he was unconcerned, which I thought was interesting. I interviewed a number of ulama, Ibadi ulama, who had done their studies. I asked about their experience of doing it and what it made them think. Most of them, interestingly enough, ended up writing their dissertations on a subject related to Ibadism. Right. But there have, of course, been Ibadis who converted to Sunni Islam. I asked the former dean of law at Sultan Qaboos University about, I said, asked him about the future of Ibadism. Right. And his reaction was, who cares? The differences are secondary issues that no one cares about anymore.
I mean, I mean, can I actually add to the anecdote you mentioned of the, that I think you said the Mufti seeming unconcerned that they would potentially leave Ibadi Islam to something like mainstream Sunnism. And I mean, this may be a result of that sort of an attitude. When I was a student as an undergraduate at Oxford, and this is back in the 2000s, I was studying with a scholar, Muhammad Akram Nadwi, who was at the Center for Islamic Studies. And he once commented that, I've had Ibadis come here and visit me with converts to Islam saying, oh, this person converted after spending time with us, and we'd like you to take care of sort of teaching him. And this was a South Asian Hanafi. And I mean, he just was very admiring of their openness. He was saying that they're not sectarian at all, right?
Yeah.
And so he maintains sort of good relations with a lot of Ibadis who are, this Oxford Center for Islamic Studies is interesting because it's kind of like a constellation of funding from throughout the Muslim world, including probably Oman at some point. So they'll have scholars associated with various different orientations coming and attending. And he says that he always loves his sort of Ibadi colleagues when they join, because he always finds them so open-minded and so sort of like, there's no sense of we're not Sunni either. And this is where, I mean, like you were also saying earlier that, they are, historically, they're very distinct from Sunnism. They're very much in the Mu'tazili tradition, and you kind of expect that with the Khariji sort of history.
Except with regard to predestination. There they are like the Asharis, actually. And Wilfeld Madlung said al-Ashari took his doctrine from the Ibadis, that the Ibadis had it first.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, sorry, who said this? Madlung said this.
Madlung said this, yes. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to have to look that one up. Madlung is always the careful surgical reader. And
yes.
But just in terms of like, that history, I wanted to ask you specifically about the transition or the diachronic transition of the last century and a half. So the Wahhabis emerge, and suddenly Kharijism is a dirty word because the Ottomans, the Azharis, everyone's sort of accusing the Wahhabis, and I use that term advisedly as well. I mean, it's not my
right.
But they're accusing them of being Khawarij. And this continues, of course, in the present, because not towards the sort of Saudi Salafi tendency as much anymore, but now in the middle of the 20th century, Geoffrey Kenny has a wonderful book called Muslim Rebels, where he looks at the way the Egyptian Azhar state starts attacking the Muslim Brotherhood. And this has been revived in the post-Arab revolutionary context. So the term Khawarij, I was very interested to hear that you were saying it's being deployed against Ibadis in 2014. This mirrors exactly what's going on in Egypt in 2013 against the Muslim Brotherhood. Right. And so I sort of wonder, now that term is completely sort of like so sullied in the public imagination that they're saying, look, don't associate us with the Khawarij, we've got nothing to do with them. And doesn't that have doesn't that represent a fundamental shift in how you sort of identify your own genealogy historically? I wonder about that question as well, and your own theological outlook. Yeah, that'll be my last sort of question.
Well, yes, I don't know. Is it a fundamental difference? I mean, even some very early epistles written by Ibadi scholars talk about al-Khawarij when they really mean all the other Khawarij, and they have always stressed the difference between them, because the Khawarij allow the killing of Muslims, etc., etc. And pardon?
That's really the Azariqa, not
it is really the Azariqa. And yet sometimes I have found that in the early Ibadi epistles, they simply talk about al-Khawarij, meaning the Azariqa. Sometimes they talk specifically about other groups. They also tend to lump the Najadat and the sometimes even the Sufriya, who are really, we don't even know of any differences, doctrinally speaking, between the Sufriya and Ibadiyya. We don't even know much about the Sufri, except that there were Sufri states, political entities in North Africa, and there were Sufris for a while in Oman as well. But so sometimes they want to make such a distinction that we are the ones who know the proper thing, and that even if we're at war, we may kill someone in war, but we're not going to go and enslave his wife and children or destroy his property. So they make this absolute distinction. One thing, I just thought of something interesting, because despite the fact that Ibadis don't go around saying, we dissociate from Sunnis or emphasizing that distinction, I was invited to participate in a panel on Ibadi tafsir when the World Middle East Studies Congress, the WACMIS, World Congress on Middle East Studies, was held in Ankara back in, I don't know, again, it was a number of years ago now, but then the Turkish organizer of that panel had me and the other panelist, who is an Omani Ibadi, and some of his friends over for dinner. And after we had eaten, they got into an argument over the Quranic verse that talks about الراسخون في العلم, right?
Yes.
And that whole question of who can know, because there's no period.
Yes.
Are those who are well-grounded in knowledge, do they simply acknowledge God, or can they know something? They got into a big argument over it. The Ibadi scholar upholding the idea that our intellects are able to know.
Right.
And the Sunni scholars insisting that we cannot. Especially one of the Sunnis was really quite Salafi in orientation, actually. So I found that very interesting. I finally put an end to it because I had to get back and go to bed. I was leaving at 3 in the morning, but it could have just gone on and on and on. I just found it fascinating, though, that this is a very important distinction. It's something that it's only going to be of significance to scholars, of course, right? To the ulama, but for an Ibadi alim to insist that Islam is maqul, right? At least on theology. Interestingly enough, on matters of law, they say we just have to accept. We don't know the difference between right and wrong. We just have to accept what God commands. But on matters of theology, they insist on the efficacy of the human intellect. And so I think that this is a very important part of the Ibadi scholars' self-perception, that we are rational. Right. And if only everybody else would open their minds, they could be convinced too.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie. This has really been a sort of wonderful, wide-ranging discussion on so many dimensions of Ibadism. We do have like 3 minutes until we get to past. So I don't know, Faisal, if you'd like to add anything to that, but it's really been sort of, so Faisal is shaking his head just so that the audience is understanding what's going on. So I guess would love to conclude by first thanking Valerie for really illuminating hour and a half of reflections on the developments within Ibadism. I'm just going to briefly sort of mention what's going to come up next week. So, pardon me, not next week, but in 2 weeks' time. So we're having fortnightly presentations. So just as we conclude, I wanted to mention that we're having Fadi Bardawil and Nadia Abu Ali talking about the left in Islamic political thought. So Fadi will be talking about a nation, class, and community, and Nadia will be talking about speaking on is the heart for the East and reason for the West. So a very different sort of, we're trying to do sort of pre-modern and then modern, then pre-modern, modern. But of course, Valerie, your own presentation covered just the whole swathe of Islamic history. So we got a lucky break this week, shall we say. So just wanted to conclude again by thanking you for giving your time, illuminating us, and sort of thanking all the participants this week who are attending from around the world, and looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. But with that, I'll bring proceedings to a close for this evening. Thanks again, Valerie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great.